So today I see a video titled "Why Does Every Mammal Get 1 Billion Heartbeats in Their Life?" That is something in my wheelhouse. And so I thought this would be very interesting to watch. Maybe I can add some personal commentary and include this in the wheelhouse of things that I do find an interest in. And ironically, I was having an interesting day also because, well, not everyone, only people that are in conversations about uh, technology, the future, modern life, I guess they may understand what I'm saying, and other people may just not care. But what I found interesting today is I was volunteering, going door to door, asking people what they felt was what they valued in terms of elections, like what issues they felt were important to them. And ironically, there was a groups of people. Well, it's Saturday as I'm recording this, and it does seem like there was groups of people that belong to Jehovah's Witnesses because they usually do that on Saturdays. They usually go to door in that same regard. Um, and it's ironic that well, the person is James Talarico, and he put himself out there in a way that um, I guess he's representing the views that he feels are Jesus Christ like, and by doing so, it seems like in the current events, people are criticized for. Well, the point of view is that historically, not everyone will agree with this, but historically, people in religious ideology have used religion as a form of harm towards other people. That's definitely true. And yet, we live in a society that glorifies that harm. They glorify and celebrate the harm because it means that they are somehow morally superior, morally exceptional, or even divinely ordained. And so, it's ironic that while going door to door asking people what they felt was the things that they cared about in modern life, and it does seem like it has to do with affordability of many things because prices seem to be not the best for many people. um, but that's adjacent. That's not my point. My point is seeing people as a part of their, they have a right to practice their religious freedom. But it is ironic that there is a sort of spiritual divide or a spiritual disagreement in different cultural backgrounds. It's not just a Christian thing. It's not just the Jehovah's Witness thing. It's just anything. Um, I guess I am someone who feels that separation of church and state is a key foundational concept of what it means to be an American, and I feel like that is not something that some people like. They don't like that. Some people don't like that being a foundational cornerstone of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because the title, Why Does Every Mammal Get 1 Billion Heartbeat in Their Life, is a very high concept question. It's a very scientific approach. It's almost futuristic thinking. And this is something that I made in a previous video where, in a snapshot, essentially, well, let me go back to my example. The example of speaking about the conversation about why people, I guess, use religion or politics in a way that harms people. I guess I've heard the James Talarico guy mention that historically that has occurred. religion has been used to harm others, and that there is a difference between claiming to be of a religion, or I guess in this case Christian, and yet not necessarily supporting what they call woke Jesus. Because honestly, Jesus Christ is the most famous woke person. I don't even think Jesus Christ is woke, but religious people call Jesus Christ woke nowadays, and that is true. There seems to be some form of animosity towards Jesus Christ, and that's sort of interesting. That there's like a line there between people that is very sensitive, and it really it actually reaches to people, and I'm interested in the why is that topic so relevant in today's time. I have an idea. So when I came back from this, asking people what, things that they felt were important to them in terms of elections, um, I don't recall right now, and it's not that relevant, but my mother mentioned something about, well, why do, well, she was referencing Bible verses and regarding this concept that people may have had that, for example, weather is like divinely ordained. Like, I'm I'm laughing. So I'll get there. So basically, the idea that why do earthquakes exist, and why do they destroy societies and kill people? Why does floods happen? Why is there like wildfires in brushland or whatever? And the idea is that supposedly Bible verses explain it as a form of God godliness. And the truth is, Christianity is not the only form of religion that even uses weather as a form of speaking about godly powers. I mean, the more famous ones are probably in the movie recently coming out, the Odyssey. The Greek gods. They also mentioned, the idea is that there is an explanation for these weather natural phenomenon, and they give these things a divine reason. They give it like, well, it was the gods, or it was God, or whatever. And in today's time, I don't think people will buy that. I don't think there's probably a crowd for people that think that way, and they're more likely to be people who are in the fundamentalist perspectives, because there does seem to be a line where, for some reason, there is an attack on the United States of, we don't like separation of church and state. And I do think that is an attack on America, because America as a cornerstone is about separation of church and state in order to bring harmony between people of various backgrounds. And aside from that, you also have the religious freedom to practice what you believe, however, without it necessarily harming other people. That's the clearest way to express it. And yet, as history knows, that has not been true in every case, because of people who are extremists, I guess, if that's the better word for it. And I am Catholic, so I'm not. This is not an attack on Christianity. This is me speaking about every religion. Like, the conversation about are the Jewish people in Israel committing a genocide? That's something that's being conversed about in current events. And also the other conversation is, are Muslim people able to even cohabitate in the United States because of, well, they reference the 9/11, but really what it is about is this idea of like, I imagine it has to do with like how women are treated, how It has to do with this sense of like what's the right word for it? I didn't mean to talk about this, but the idea is just extremist attacks, I guess, or oh yes, this is what I meant to talk about. Like for example, like if people who are more fundamentalist is just a concept. It's not necessarily a religion. It's just an idea that whatever religion that is existing, it doesn't have to be Christianity. It could be Jewish. It could be Muslim. It could be like, what is it? Hinduism. I don't know. Like how extreme is their point of view, and would that impact, or would they care about everyone's right to have religious freedom? Because if, let's say, Muslim people don't believe in that people have deserve to have civil rights, let's say that, well, they would have to adopt, or I mean adapt to civility, I guess, in the United States, you know? And then there's the idea, well, what if they don't adapt in a way that is civil, and then they for discriminate other people? And it involves, like, what if they discriminate Christians? What if they discriminate Jewish people? All of these things, you know? So these conversations are in current events. Now, the reason why I mentioned this is because fundamentalist essentially is saying that you would interpret whatever religion you believe in literally to the word. And so the question, or just the conversation I had with my mother about weather phenomenon, like what is the source of it? The Bible, I guess, maybe it does have some Bible verses about it being at times some sort of like divinely ordained thing. But here's the thing. The line in the United States right now is really being defined whether you really believe in science or do you believe in fundamentalism. And I'm not on the fundamentalist side. I am on the science side. And so the title, why does every mammal get 1 billion heartbeats in their life? It does make me question. It's a good question because it's speaking about mortality. It's speaking about science, like the actual design of the not human body, the mammal body. And I have not watched. I started watching the video, but then I thought, this would be interesting to at least like watch, and then maybe if I have commentary to like comment on it. But because I previously made a video on, well, the one thing I will agree with, because I mean, I'm not a politics guy, I'm more of a music guy and a science guy. The one thing I will agree with Sam Altman and Elon Musk and other tech guys is that technology is what makes modern life today. The technology, the innovation of modern science is what's allowing people to have better outcomes or better quality of life in today's time. And that is the world that was desired 2,000 years ago. That is the truth. And maybe in 2026, we are living in a world where 300 years from now, they will think that we lived in a more primordial world. We don't know. We never know. No one ever knows what thing will happen next. Everything that's occurred in history was an unknown. It just occurred. But it was intended to happen. What I'm trying to say is, if you believe that, let's say in the 1600s or in the 1700s, white people, Asian people, black people, it doesn't matter what race you were, if they were poor and they were uneducated and they were illiterate, they were not conceived or perceived. They were not perceived as intelligent. That is, it's obvious. It's in the history books. That is something that is already in conversation. And so, if that was perceived of them in the 1600s, in the 1700s, in the 1800s, where they did not know the reason why people would die of illnesses, they did not know the nature of bacteria, they didn't know how to address. The idea was that they wanted to know things so that they could live better lives. Okay? So, in order to do that, the concept or the phenomenon of scientific thinking or studies or research is what invented the modern world. And so without that, we would be living in more prehistoric times. Why I mention this is because, well, if you think that 300 years ago people were stupid, why were people 2,000 years ago not even more stupid? Why would they not be? So you're telling me that you went 1,700 years of really intelligent and somehow divinely intelligent people, but then in the 1600s and the 1700s they were just stupid. That doesn't make sense. So that is probably not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why I don't believe in that the Bible can be literally interpreted. And that is the line in the United States where many people are at today. Whether there does seem to be a divide or a cultural divide in, are you someone who is willing to maybe pursue information or knowledge or even be skeptical about things in life? Or are you someone who would just be or someone who would accept interpretations, let's say that literal interpretations of the Bible, because it is an important artifact in human history? Are you someone who would just be literally interpreting what it says there as a way of living life? And none of what I'm saying is actually a critique on the Bible. I think that it's a very good source for finding support in life. It's just the question whether it's just a matter of whether you do or not, base your entire life on what people believed 2,000 years ago. Like I'm not someone. It's not about me. My point is, there are many people who would not live their life like as if they were living in 0 BC. It probably would even be impossible to do that unless you purposefully I don't know, unless you purposely live in that type of mentality. I guess the Amish people are one type of people, I guess. I don't know Amish people, but they probably do exist. So now back to the video. The question, why does every mammal get 1 billion heartbeats in their life? It's addressing, well, I haven't watched the video. I'll watch the video, but it's addressing, to me, it's addressing a question that's on the internet. It just seems to be something that's a current event. And that is involving one sort of meme public figure, Brian Johnson, where he's become a meme for talking about. He's honestly not the only person. He's just becoming a meme for it. So people already have these conversations, and he's just memeing himself in this way. Essentially, he's memed himself as, because he has a lot of money, he's talking about extending his lifespan in a way that actually is reversing his age or his aging of the body. And whether or not money and scientific research can have an outcome of doing that, but also maybe even finding a way to be immortal, and whether that's even worth it. And so the question is, why does every mammal get 1 billion heartbeats in their life? Well, if you were to try to make people immortal, then you would have to address this. You would have to address the aging of every body system and successfully reverse the aging of it so that people wouldn't die of aging of their organs, I guess. And so if that is not possible, then maybe you would not be able to make people immortal. But let's see why this person says, apparently they have the answer as to why mammals have 1 billion heartbeats.
In the 1960s, the CIA was working on a top-secret project known as MK-Ultra, and one of their main goals was to find out how drugs like LSD could be used to change human behavior. And this is where elephants come in, because elephants are normally quite docile, but sometimes they just snap. And the hypothesis was that this change in behavior might be triggered by the release of an LSD-like substance that naturally occurs in their brains. So if that's true, then administering LSD to a docile elephant might reproduce that behavior. So the real question was, how much LSD should you give an elephant so that the dose is large enough to cause a psychological reaction, but not so large that it causes harm? Well, the researchers didn't know. LSD had never been given to an animal that big. But they did know that the safe dose in cats was around 0.3 milligrams. Now, since an elephant has around 1,000 times the mass of a cat, they figured we'll give it 1,000 times the dose. They received approval to perform the experiment on Tusco, an Indian elephant at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Oklahoma. And there, they injected him with nearly 300 milligrams of LSD. But within 5 minutes, Tusco trumpeted, collapsed, fell heavily onto his right side, defecated, and went into status epilepticus. They administered a few other drugs in an attempt to revive him, but Tusco died shortly thereafter. The mistake they made was to assume that safe drug dosage scales linearly with mass. It does not. And it turns out there are a lot of things like this that don't scale in the way you'd expect.
Is this your car insurance premium? This? Even this?
They don't want us to know that there's an easy way to lower your car insurance costs. What you do is you go to simplify.com and
scale in the way you'd expect. For example, take the smallest mammal by mass, the Etruscan shrew, and the largest land mammal, the African bush elephant. Which do you think has more heartbeats over the course of its entire life? Well, an African elephant has around 1 billion heartbeats in its lifetime, and an Etruscan shrew also has 1 billion heartbeats in its lifetime. What about a wallaby? Also 1 billion. A two-toed sloth? 1 billion again. Just about every mammal, no matter what environment they live in, how large they are, or even whether they live for 1 year or 100 years, they all get around 1 billion heartbeats between the day they're born and the day they die.
Why 1 billion? Why not 1 million? Why not 1,000?
I mean, is this true? I'm going to bore people, but essentially the heart organ is proportional to the body of whatever animal it is. So it's not unusual that that could even be true, because if a tiny animal has a smaller heart, and so therefore it pumps a different amount of, it pumps a different amount of blood as, let's say, an elephant, but it proportionally may pump the same amount. So you know, like it's not the same thing. They're talking about two different things: the amount of blood you have, and then how much you're pumping proportional to your body. So what I'm trying to say is, are some animals, I would imagine so, because the hummingbird, for example, I don't know that the hummingbird is counting as a mammal. Maybe it does, but they technically have a very, very fast heartbeat, and they have to have sugar, or like, you know, they have to like intake food or nutrition, or they do die faster for some reason. And so maybe different animals have different heart rates. And also, let's, like, like, in humans, we sort of understand, or there's public conversation about the effect of stress and or even like purposeful harm on people, and how that type of stress can, not give people better quality of life. So it's not enough to say, well, is their resting, or is their normal heart rate the what is considered the ordinary amount. Sometimes there are variations because of nutritional factors, income, let's say, or many reasons. And so saying that you have 1 billion heartbeats is not saying how fast, like, it's not saying like what amount of time is your heartbeats, beating. It's just saying that's how many you have, not saying how much, the time that they do beat in. So if people were to be stressed, what does that, and let's say they have a clogged heart and they're not able to beat properly, and they have heart disease, well, then the quality of their heartbeats are probably not as good as others. So the number is not that important. It's more so, are you having like a high heart rate? And that's kind of strange too, because when you work out, you naturally do end up having a higher heart rate anyways. So my joke is really like, my joke here is, so are you supposed to live a life where you just have a lower heart rate, like you don't do anything, and then you have technically a lower heart rate, and then so you're preventing, or you're expanding your lifespan, but then people say how you have to work out, because even though it increases your heart rate, it actually causes a counterintuitive effect of lowering your resting heart rate. You see what I mean? So my point of view on this is that there are many reasons, and I'll give that respect, but I do feel like people may give up on their bodies. I don't think people live in their bodies. And I know this because I have been trying to live in my body, because I am aware of body injuries that I should not be living, and I'm trying to address those things. But I feel like many people may not give themselves that opportunity. It's not about losing fat, it's about functional movement, and that's something that I've been really researching for over a decade. And I really like Connor Harris and Strength Side Channel. I keep saying that not as a fanboy, but as like, they are really excellent at what I feel. For me, they are excellent at their approach in functional movement. So I ended up in this topic, but what I'm trying to talk about is, like the number, if you have 1 billion 1 billion heartbeats, well, that's not really saying what the quality of your heart rate is. So I'm gonna get back to the video.
Not these other numbers.
That is, every mammal except one. This video is in large part based on the book Scale by Jeffrey West. If you want to learn more, I'll put a link to it down in the description. What's even more curious is that just by knowing a mammal's mass, you can predict a staggering number of biological traits, from its pulse rate and reproductive output to its total lifespan. The same pattern holds for cities. If you know the population and location, that allows you to forecast everything from average wages and patent filings to crime rates, disease prevalence, and even the literal speed at which pedestrians walk. So how is that possible? Well, for that, we have to go back to the case of Tusko the elephant. Researchers assumed that safe drug dosage is proportional.
A joke about every gay man who walks really fast.
To mass, double the dose. But it turns out that the speed at which an animal can process chemical compounds doesn't depend directly on its mass. It depends more on its metabolic rate, that is, the number of calories it uses in a given amount of time.
There's a lot going on in your body. Your heart is pumping. That takes energy. You're moving food around. Digestion takes energy. Keeping your brain going takes energy. Breathing. Everything that you do requires energy.
For a cat, for a single day, they require roughly 250 kilocalories of energy, used by all of their trillions of cells. But there is nothing special about a cat's cells. If you take a cat's cells and an elephant's cells and put them under a microscope, you'll find they're a similar size, similar makeup, and they perform the same sorts of functions. The same is true for other animals. In other words, the building blocks of animals are always roughly the same. So an elephant that has 1,000 times the mass has about 1,000 times as many cells. So you'd expect it would need 1,000 times as much energy, so 250,000 kilocalories per day. But that is where you run into problems.
Check this out. I'm going to show you how I afforded this car. Ready? Okay. $98 for car insurance. That's what I was paying, yeah? I picked up the car a few months ago, and watch this. Ready? 80.
But that is where you run into problems.
So what's the issue here? If I'm an organism and I'm burning up energy all day long, that energy is radiated out in the form of body heat. So we're constantly losing heat through our surface, through our skin, to the environment.
To see why this matters, let's simplify the problem and do the standard physicist thing. Let's assume our animals are perfect spheres. To be clear, this isn't necessary for the argument to work, but it does make everything a lot easier to follow. Since the volume of an animal is proportional to its mass, our 3,000 kilogram elephant has a volume 1,000 times greater than our 3 kilogram cat. So its radius must be 10 times larger. That's because volume is proportional to radius cubed. But surface area only grows as radius squared. So the elephant's surface area only increases by a factor of 100. Generating 1,000 times as much heat while only having 100 times the surface area to radiate it away would end very poorly for the elephant. If this were the case, it would boil alive. So in 1838, French scientists proposed a different scaling law. Since metabolism generates heat, and that heat is radiated through the surface, metabolic rate, or B, should scale in proportion to the surface area, A, instead. This became known as the surface law. Now, we can rewrite this to see how metabolic rate scales as a function of mass. Surface area is proportional to radius squared, so we can swap that in. And if mass is proportional to radius cubed, then radius must be proportional to mass to the 1/3. Plugging that in for R, we find that metabolic rate should scale with mass to the 2/3.
Really familiar example would come from thinking about cooking. Maybe you want to make a big turkey for Thanksgiving. People commonly phrase it as, how long do I need per pound? But that, you realize, is linear thinking. The important thing is really the thickness of the bird or the roast, because the heat is coming in by conduction from the oven, and it's got to do thermal diffusion into the meat. The time for the diffusion will scale like the characteristic length, which in this case would be the thickness of the meat. It'll go like the dimension squared. Whereas volume of the meat is going to be like length cubed.
But then, this is more of an aside, but it's the way my ADHD brain thinks. And then people mention how they boycott hormonal meat, essentially because hormones essentially make, you know, they're steroids. They're making chickens into chads. Essentially, they're making muscular chickens, and they're super chickens, and then they're killed because they have more meat, and therefore they can feed more people, and people are fed. What I'm trying to say is placing steroids and testosterone or whatever steroids they place on animals, making people have more food. Because then they say, well, I want my chicken to be organic. I don't want it to be hormonal. And then they list the reasons why. So is it more economical to have them be chad chickens and be like muscular chickens? Because that's essentially what you're eating their muscles. Like, you know. So it would be the equivalent of like going to your local gym and seeing a guy who is on steroids and then cooking him up and feeding him to the wolves at the forest, you know, like, there you go. Hormonal human meat. That's what chickens are. So I don't know. I guess maybe it is economical to give them hormones so that people can be fed more, essentially. I'm sure there are studies about this, but I just thought that was funny.
And that's proportional to the weight of the bird or the roast. So when you put those things together, you'll get that the characteristic amount of time needed to cook the roast will go like its mass to the 2/3 power.
So if I'm thinking about, cooking a roast that weighs twice as much as another roast, how much longer? Is that 2 to the 2/3 the time?
Yeah, if you wanted to double the weight, then you only have to cook it about 60% longer, not 100% longer.
Similarly, according to this scaling, an elephant that's 1,000 times as heavy as a cat should only burn 100 times as many calories, so 25,000 instead of 250,000. And the appropriate dose of LSD for Tusco would have been just 30 milligrams. These two wildly different predictions come from different assumptions about how metabolic rate scales as a function of mass. But notice in both cases, it's just proportional to mass raised to some power. These kinds of relationships are called power laws, and all power laws have a special property. If you take the logarithm of the x and y values, you get a straight line, and the slope of the line is equal to the exponent of the power law. This makes it easy to identify different types of power laws. If the slope is 1, that's just everyday linear scaling. If it's less than 1, like the surface law, that is called sublinear scaling. And if it's larger than 1, that is known as superlinear scaling. For nearly 100 years, biologists generally agreed that the 2/3 exponent of the surface law was the correct one for metabolic rate. But then, in 1932, Swiss biologist Max Kleiber decided to put it to the test. He took the metabolic rates of different animals, from a small dove at 150 grams to a large steer at 680,000 grams, and then he plotted them against their mass on a log-log plot. And as expected, all the data did fall on a straight line, but the slope wasn't 2/3. Instead, it was about 3/4. This became known as Kleiber's law. It implies that if you double an animal's mass, metabolic rate goes up by about 1.68, an increase of 68% instead of the 59%, which would be predicted by the 2/3 scaling law. So according to Kleiber's law, an elephant burns roughly 178 times as many calories as a cat, or about 45,000 kilocalories. And the actual LSD dose Tusco should have received.
I mean, are they taking into account the environment? Because he literally said that heat would, the calories inside your body could theoretically disappear or dissipate outside, through heat. What's the right word? Heat relief. What I'm trying to say is like different animals have different forms of maintaining their internal body temperature when they're outside. And many people know that cats are living inside homes, unless they're wild. But like my point is, elephants, I don't think an elephant is living inside your house. So their environment, like, I don't think elephants sweat. I don't recall learning that they sweat. What my point is, when they say like this is the average, or the idea of how much, or this is the number of their metabolic rate, is that including already their environment? Because they have the metabolic rate is one thing, but if they're in the environment where they have to, run, or they have to do strenuous physical activity in the wild, that's a very different lifestyle than a cat who's living inside your home. So, the metabolic rate alone is not enough to say how many calories do they have to spend. There's a bunch of fat cats.
Was 53 milligrams, which is around a sixth of the dose the researchers gave him. So that explains the dosing catastrophe with Tusco the elephant. Kleiber's original work was based on a small dataset, primarily made up of mammals. But if you plot the data for a larger range of mammals, as well as for other animals like birds, reptiles, and fish, you find that they all follow roughly the same scaling relationship. Now, they don't all fit perfectly onto the same line because the base metabolic rate for warm-blooded animals is higher than for cold-blooded ones, but they all scale according to the same power law: mass raised to the 3/4. Some argue that this relationship expands all the way down to single cells and the molecular machines inside of them. If that's true, Kleiber's law governs life spanning more than 25 orders of magnitude. But then the question is, if an elephant has so many more cells, and each cell is a similar size to a cell in a smaller creature, and yet it's using proportionately less energy, like it's got a lower metabolic rate per pound or per kilo or per cell, that's really saying that those cells are functioning with much less energy.
It's like there's some efficiency to being big, and it's hard to understand why. What is it that the cells are providing to each other, somehow cooperating in some way?
I just put in my calculator 100 to the 3/4. So if you got an organism that's 100 times bigger, then according to this, only 31.6 times the metabolic rate. So it seems like a big savings.
It's a massive improvement, right? It's a big savings. It's a biological fact, but people have been arguing now for a century what accounts for this 3/4.
In the decades following Kleiber's observation, the mystery only deepened. Researchers discovered that brain size also roughly scales as mass to the 3/4, and so does an animal's growth rate and the amount of blood pumped per minute. But not every property scales as mass to the 3/4.
If you ask how long a creature will live, a mammal, that tends to be proportional to its mass to the 1/4 power. 1/4, not 3/4.
Lowering my ask to just $1 today, and here's why. This Senate race in Texas is likely going to be the most expensive and the most competitive.
3/4.
So that means if you double the mass of a mammal, then on average, its lifespan is around 19% longer. Similarly, blood circulation time also scales as roughly mass to the 1/4, while breathing rate and heart rate both scale to the negative 1/4. They're not all 3/4 power laws, but they are all multiples of a quarter. So the question on everyone's mind was, where are these quarter power scaling laws coming from? One popular theory emerged in the 1990s.
Brian Enquist was studying for an undergraduate degree in biology.
In most of the biology classes then that you take, you learn about the Krebs cycle, and then you have to...
Oh shoot, I hate that.
Only deepened. Researchers discovered that brain size also roughly scales as mass to the 3/4, and so does an animal's growth rate and the amount of blood pumped per minute. But not every property scales as mass to the 3/4.
If you ask how long a creature will live, a mammal, that tends to be proportional to its mass to the 1/4 power. 1/4, not 3/4.
So that means if you double the mass of a mammal, then on average, its lifespan is around 19% longer. Similarly, blood circulation time also scales as roughly mass to the 1/4, while breathing rate and heart rate both scale to the negative 1/4. They're not all 3/4 power laws, but they are all multiples of a quarter. So the question on everyone's mind was, where are these quarter power scaling laws coming from? One popular theory emerged in the 1990s.
I was trying to read. Mr. Van Dyck is a producer at Veritasium, okay?
Brian Enquist was studying for an undergraduate degree in biology.
In most of the biology classes then that you take, you...
Ecology and evolutionary biology professor. Okay, Mr. Enquist.
learn about the Krebs cycle, and then you have to memorize all the different parts of a flower, and then they have a different terminology for everything.
But then one day he took a zoology class where they showed him those quarter power scaling plots.
I just couldn't believe it. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. You know, this is kind of like something fundamental that's kind of like underlying biological diversity. And there I knew immediately that I wanted to kind of quit my specialized kind of plant physiology research and do something associated with scaling.
So Enquist started studying for his PhD under Professor James Brown, who had been thinking about scaling laws for years. So they knew that often when power laws appear, there's some form of self-similarity in the underlying system. So they wondered, what could that self-similarity be? And they suspected that it might have something to do with the way resources are transported through the body, specifically the networks that do this. They had the biological intuition, but to get a complete theory, they needed a formal mathematical framework. In other words, they needed a mathematician, or a theoretical physicist.
And And at the time, Jim was associated with the Santa Fe Institute, and he started asking around, is there anyone up here that's interested in these biological scaling relationships? And then the president at the time said, you know what, I know of this physicist who's up at Los Alamos who was talking about biological scaling relationships. And so we met Jeffrey, and it was like immediately, it's like we've been talking about the same things for like years. It's like, finding, someone who's been like speaking your language, but no one could understand you.
So West, Brown, and Enquist teamed up to try and find a compelling explanation for Kleiber's law. They started by assuming three simple premises. The first premise is that the networks that distribute resources are space-filling, since they need to reach every cell in the body. The second premise is that the terminal units of those networks, the thinnest segments on the outer periphery of the delivery system, have the same width regardless of the size of the organism. That is, the outermost blood vessels that carry nutrients to an elephant's skin cells are about as thick as the ones in a mouse. The elephant just has many more of them. And the third premise is that over time, evolution has driven these transport networks toward an efficient design. So what should such a network look like? Well, intuitively, to get fuel from one place to another as efficiently as possible, you want the path to be as short as possible, so basically a straight line. But because fuel needs to reach every part of the body, you would also need many different paths. And as you go to larger and larger organisms, the networks inside need to reach a larger and larger volume. One way to do this is to stretch all the paths and match the growth of the animal. In this case, the volume of the animal should scale as these internal path lengths cubed. Or if we rearrange that, internal path length should scale as volume to the 1/3, just like the overall length of the animal does. But this design is incredibly wasteful. Take these two regions. The two vessels that are bringing blood here go through almost the same path in the body, and they only split up just before they reach their destinations. If instead we had just one...
Unless you're a child, because apparently childs have very big heads and tiny bodies, so they don't have the same distance in their body.
Vessel up to this point and split it only when the paths needed to diverge, we could serve the two regions using a lot less vessel material and a lot less blood to fill the vessels. Of course, you can extend this logic for all the blood vessels in the body, and you end up with a much more efficient design of branching blood vessels. But now we run into another issue, because each branching point provides an opportunity for some of the blood to bounce back, that is, reflect. If you have many reflections, that would mean it costs significantly more energy to pump blood around. So next, they argue that nature should favor structures that minimize reflections. And as it turns out, this happens if the cross-sectional area of the vessels stays the same before and after the branching. So if you've got a cross-sectional area of 2 centimeters squared for the main vessel, then each of the two branches need to have an area of 1 centimeter squared each, for large vessels at least. For smaller ones, daughter branches can be a bit thicker to allow blood to slow down and exchange resources with the tissue it's reaching. If you keep repeating this pattern across the network, you end up with this, a branching self-similar fractal. And if you look at the actual shape of the circulatory system, it has this geometry. So it seemed like they were onto something.
Yeah, it's a little broccoli. It's a little broccoli tree inside your lungs.
But how do you get from this to quarter power scaling laws? Well, mathematician Felix Hausdorff discovered that self-similar fractals have an interesting property. Take a straight line segment. It's completely one-dimensional and not a fractal at all. Hausdorff assigned this line segment a value of 1.0. But now imagine adding a few bends. And more bends to those bends. If you keep doing this, the line becomes more and more fractal-like. Eventually, if you keep applying the right kind of contortions, that one-dimensional line segment fills up an entire region of the 2D plane. Hausdorff assigned these space-filling fractal curves a value of 2.0, corresponding to their dimensionality. The same ideas apply to a 2D surface.
So think about a piece of paper, right? Two-dimensional. All then the fractal network is doing is crumpling up that sheet of paper, and it effectively fills a ball of volume. So you can now describe that sheet of paper as a sphere instead of a two-dimensional sheet of paper.
I'm in high school and I have absolutely no idea what I want to do for my career. And that's what I would have said if I never used
that sheet of paper as a sphere instead of a two-dimensional sheet of paper.
Repeat the right pattern of folds at smaller and smaller scales, and a 2D surface fills more and more of a 3D volume. In the mathematical limit, it becomes space-filling, with a Hausdorff dimension of 3.0.
Biologically, well, what does that mean? That enables an organism for a given size to pack in more of these metabolic surface areas than would be expected. And it's because of this fractal-like structure that enables you then to pack in and have all of these folds and convolutions and on top of each other, to pack in an enormous amount of membrane surfaces.
As a result, the Hausdorff dimension of the surface of the circulatory system is roughly 3, meaning its surface area doesn't scale as its length squared, but its length cubed. And since the metabolic rate hinges on how fast resources can be exchanged across the surface area, well, it must also scale like length cubed.
But remember, West, Brown, and Enquist wanted to explain Kleiber's law, so they needed to know how metabolic rate scales with mass. Since every cell needs to be served by the network, this means that the volume around the network should be proportional to the animal's mass. And since volume is just surface area times length, and surface area is proportional to length cubed, that means both volume and mass must be proportional to length to the 4th, which can be rewritten to show that length is proportional to mass raised to the 1/4. And if you plug that into the equation for the metabolic rate, you find that the metabolic rate must be proportional to mass to the 3/4. Exactly as Max Kleiber had found. West, Brown, and Enquist published their work in 1997, and it soon came to be known as WBE theory, after their initials.
And the theory is quite rigid. It makes very specific predictions. This is good science, okay? This is sticking your neck out, and it's an incredibly beautiful theory.
Take a look at this table from Jeffrey West's book. These are the scaling exponents WBE theory predicts, including many that are not multiples of a quarter, but all follow from the same theory. For example, the radius of an animal's aorta should scale with its mass to the 3/8, or 0.375, and the area of its lungs should scale with mass to the 11/12, or about 0.92. In total, this chart makes 26 different predictions.
I'm pausing this out of generosity. I feel like I don't think people care about this stuff, but I find it interesting.
Now, these are the observed data. Radius of the aorta, 0.36. Lung area, 0.95.
That's the really shocking thing about what they did. They had a table with something like, 20 or 30 predictions of exotic exponents, and that's what you really see in the data. So this one theory accounts not only for the 3/4 power of metabolism, but for literally dozens of other things that biologists have measured.
Some of the scaling laws are easy to explain once you've got the 3/4 law for metabolism. Take a mammal's heart rate, for instance. Heart rate is equal to the blood flow rate over the amount or volume of blood in every beat. The volume of blood per beat has been found to scale in direct proportion to an animal's mass, so that's just M. And the blood flow rate? Well, remember that metabolism is all about how nutrients get distributed around the body, so most biologists agree metabolic rate and blood flow rate are directly proportional to one another. So heart rate should scale as metabolic rate over mass. Swapping in the scaling law Kleiber had found, that gives us M to the minus 1/4. Meaning bigger animals should have slower heartbeats than smaller ones, and this is exactly what we observe in nature. The world's smallest mammal, the Etruscan shrew, has an extraordinary heart rate of 1,200 beats per minute. That's 20 beats per second. Whereas the biggest land mammal, the African bush elephant, has a typical heart rate of only 30 beats per minute. And we can do something similar for lifespan. One of the leading theories is that an animal's lifespan is based on the accumulation of metabolic damage. That is, as each chunk of tissue in an organism processes nutrients over time, this causes damage to accumulate. And that, over time, causes the animal to die. So the rate at which an animal accumulates damage is its metabolic rate per unit of mass, and its lifespan should be the inverse of that rate. If damage accumulates faster, it dies sooner. If it accumulates slower, it lives longer. So lifespan is proportional to M over V, or substituting in Kleiber's law, M to the 1/4. So lifespan should increase with mass, and you do see this in nature.
And this is why the cruelty of, it's not the only people, but the cruelty of fundamentalists who do harm other people is, to me, obscene. The idea that people have is like, I am so holy because I don't shoot people to murder them. But yeah, but you do cause them damage on a daily basis. And therefore, you are slowly, you're essentially more of a poisonous person. You're a poison. You're just killing people. You don't have to shoot someone to kill someone. So I hate the hypocrisy of like this, like, well like my life matters, and so I'm going to harm other people because their lives don't matter. That's literally history here in the United States.
Shrew only lives for 1 to 2 years in the wild, while the mighty African elephant can live up to 70 years. So if you're a small mammal, you have many heartbeats per minute, but you live a relatively short life. Conversely, if you're a larger mammal, your heart beats much slower and you live a lot longer.
So it's the, live fast and burn out and, die young, right? Or spend it frugally and live a really long life.
But you might have also noticed something else. Heart rate scales as B over M, so it equals B over M times some constant. And lifespan scales as...
He must be being some... He must be being some form of sardonic here, because that's not... that was not an interpretation of what that meant. The assumption is that, well, if you're a larger mammal then and you have a slower heartbeat, then you would have theoretically a longer lifespan, but that's not what that statistic was saying. What it was saying is that biologically smaller mammals with faster heartbeats have a shorter lifespan, period. It has nothing to do with how they live their life. Is just they have a smaller lifespan. So to confuse the science with people is sort of like there's an agenda. Now, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying that's not what that meant. And so people who are just watching the video for to feel smart or to learn something, well, they should be able to notice that he was not talking about the actual meaning of whatever they were talking about. He was just adding something else, and to make himself sound likable or even approachable by people, because there is this idea that if you repeat, what's the right word? not parable. I'm not going to remember this word right now. It's a word that is platitudes. Repeating platitudes is a form of like connecting with people in a way, because they're like common phrases like calling the tea kettle black, or well, that's a good one, but I don't know what other ones. Platitudes. So by repeating platitudes, for some reason, people feel like they are being connected to the person, and that's sort of how this works. Like the expression of information in a way that is like connecting with people is engaging, and so there's still like 12 more minutes of this. So the editors did this.
M over B. They're inverses of each other. They scale in equal and opposite directions. Now, the total number of heartbeats in an animal's life is just the heart rate multiplied by the lifespan. So when you multiply these two terms, they cancel out, leaving you with just a constant. So that suggests that no matter what mammal you're talking about, it should have roughly the same number of heartbeats. You can find that number by just plugging in some examples. Let's start with the Etruscan shrew. The shrew's 1,200 beats per minute multiplied by a lifespan of around 1.5 years gives you around 950 million heartbeats in the course of the shrew's life. Meanwhile, an African elephant's 30 beats per minute multiplied by a lifespan of around 65 years gives you a little over 1 billion heartbeats. And we could keep going, but for nearly every mammal you look at, you keep landing at the same figure of around 1 billion heartbeats. This is why nearly every mammal, from a tiny field mouse to a gazelle, from a cheetah to a hippopotamus, they all get around 1 billion heartbeats between the day they're born and the day they die. But there is one major outlier, one mammal that gets significantly more than 1 billion heartbeats, and that is us, humans. We are the lucky ones. 3 centuries ago, humans were much closer to the standard value of 1 billion heartbeats. But around the mid-1800s, germ theory and better sanitation methods became widespread, causing a stark decrease in the number of child mortalities and deaths from disease. So life expectancy began to climb up, and with it, the average number of heartbeats in a lifetime. If you look closely, you can also see some significant drops, like this 1918 dip from the Spanish flu pandemic, or over here, what appears to be the impact of the Second World War. But overall, the trend is clear. We have systematically been increasing the number of heartbeats we get in our lifetime to the point where now the average human gets nearly 3 billion heartbeats before they die. I don't know if there's a better argument for science and technology than this. It has literally given the average human more than a full extra life. And it's not just humans. Other mammals have been observed to have much longer lives in captivity when they're away from the hazards they would naturally encounter in the wild.
Right. What I was just saying like 20 minutes ago.
Or if you look at it purely from the number of years we get, we now have the lifespan of a much larger mammal, somewhere between an elephant and a whale. But there is one curious thing about this trend. Take a look at this graph. It looks surprisingly similar to the graph from before. In fact, if you overlay them, they look remarkably similar. Now I want you to take a guess at what this graph is. Have you got your answer? It is the number of people living in cities. For these two charts, we're using data from parts of the United Kingdom, where the record keeping goes back several centuries. But the rest of the world has followed similar trends.
The curriculum is intentionally structured across 4 semesters. You'll start with foundations, programming, machine learning, and data engineering. Then move into LLM applications, MLOps.
Goes back several centuries, but the rest of the world has followed similar trends. Of course, that doesn't mean cities cause people to live longer, but it goes against the perception of cities as being full of pollution and breeding grounds for disease. Already in 1889, a medical doctor wrote, "The poisonous germs and pollutions of the city, its impure air and water, bad sewage, and endless nuisances." So how do you reconcile these two views? Or more specifically, is there any quantitative data on how smaller cities compare to larger ones?
It turns out this is something that Jeffrey West pursued after his work with Brown and Enquist. He and collaborators like Luis Betancourt and
I have a totally random and unique thought that's coming to me, and I don't know that other people would even have this idea, but I think it's funny. When, let's say, okay, the question is a doctor who has to declare someone dead. Is declaring someone dead easier if the person is not a public figure? Or is it harder if the person is well known? And is that somehow unfair? Because the idea, for example, what I'm trying to say is, I don't know, there's some sort of expectation that the healthcare system should treat people with dignity and compassion and equally. But is that really true? Like, let's say in your city, let's say someone that was well known there. Let's say it was the mayor. And let's say the mayor goes to the hospital. First of all, do they get their own room? What hospital do they go to? Do they have a roommate? Do they even get to have roommates with the regular people? My point is, I don't know why I thought about this, but like, would the doctor be emotional? Would the doctor be like, yeah, the mayor died, and to me it's the same thing as another person dying? Or would they be, oh my god, the mayor died? Like, I don't know. I think that's funny because it sort of like points at like, is everyone, these are the questions that people find sensitive. Is everyone's death the same? I don't know. Would the doctor have a harder time telling, well, whoever the family is, like telling them, oh well, they died? Or would they be like, yeah, they were a public figure, but you know, I've said other people have died plenty of times and they weren't public figures, so to me it's the same thing. I feel like I would be like that, but I don't know if people would find that kosher. I feel like I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on this, but do people feel like they are they so into themselves that they feel like they somehow are just more like they just matter more, like their death matters more than other people? And so when they are declared dead, then people should act like it, like their death matters more. I don't know, I guess I'm being a bit facetious, but yeah.
Others have looked at scaling laws in cities.
They looked at how different properties, like the amount of crime, scale as the population of the city increases. And what they found is that if you plot serious crimes on a log-log plot, the data clusters around a straight line with a slope of 1.15, meaning crime grows faster than linear or superlinear. So for every doubling of a city's population, you get around 2.2 times as many criminal cases, or around 120% more crime, as opposed to the 100% you might naively expect. To make matters worse, researchers found that the same general pattern holds for the amount of wastewater and even the number of AIDS cases. The exact exponents vary a little, but overall, as cities grow larger, you systematically get more of each. So it seems like that medical doctor was onto something. And you might think life on Earth would be better off if we all lived in small towns instead. But that might not be the case. In 2006, Dirk Halbing, Christian Kunert, and Jeffrey West looked at how the number of gas stations scales as a function of population.
If a city is twice as big, does it need twice as many gas stations? Because, we have to supply, not exactly nutrients, but energy, gas for all those cars.
The naive expectation is that if you double the number of cars, you're going to need to double the amount of fuel, so double the gas stations. To find out whether this was true, they plotted the data on a log-log plot and found a straight line. But the exponent wasn't 1, it was about 0.8. This means that for every doubling, you only need around 74% more gas stations, which is a decent savings. The amount of roads and electrical cables also scale in roughly the same way. The rough figure that West gives in his book is that they all have scaling exponents of around 0.85.
It is interesting that some of the things that we can share, like you can drive on the road, but so can I. When it's shared resources, yes, cities can be surprisingly green. The argument is that cities can be even greener than you might think, than living out in the middle of nowhere.
But cities have even bigger benefits. Things like total wages, GDP, and the number of patents all scale superlinearly, with exponents that cluster somewhere around 1.15. Meaning that for every doubling in size, you get around 120% more of each. All of this becomes especially significant when you compare a small town of, say, 50,000 people to a city 100 times its size, because infrastructure needs only need to go up by a factor of about 50, while total wages, GDP, patents, and inventions, they all go up by a factor of 200. Unfortunately, disease and crime also go up by the same factor. Or look at it this way, on a per-person basis, you'd only need about half the infrastructure, while you get double all the socio-economic factors. So cities, far from being detrimental to the world, they might actually be one of our best inventions, and an indirect driver of a lot of scientific and technological progress. Perhaps this is also why people often say that life in the city feels faster. A feeling that seems justified because researchers looked at how fast people walk in cities of different sizes, and they found that people literally do walk faster in larger cities.
That turns out to depend on city size. It's not just that the sidewalks are congested or not, it's just like the vibe gets people amped up. They move faster in cities.
So the pace of life seems to be increasing, but that may come at a cost, because as one person put it, everything nowadays is ultra. Everything is being transcended continually in thought as well as in action. No one knows himself any longer. Young people are stirred up much too early in life and then carried away in the whirl of the times. Wealth and rapidity are what the world admires. Could it be that life is accelerating so fast that humans won't be able to keep up? Well, probably not, because this quote was written in 1825 by Wolfgang von Goethe. For the past 200 years, and probably longer, almost every generation has felt like life was accelerating, and yet every generation has managed. So I think it's likely we can continue to adapt indefinitely. And as cities continue to grow in size, all of us will continue to reap the benefit of economies of scale, in much the same way that mammals benefit from being larger. But while WBE theory seems to predict where the exponents in biological scaling laws come from, for cities, there is no widely accepted explanatory theory yet. Trying to explain where those exponents of 0.85 and 1.15 come from is one of the big goals for theorists. Although, even WBE theory is not universally accepted. For one, the fact it predicts the right exponents doesn't necessarily mean the theory itself is correct. There are a few other theories that predict some of the same scaling exponents, and there are also some other critiques.
There's a lot of discussion. It may look convincing, and personally, I tend to think it is very impressive. But I have very good colleagues like Peter Dodds at University of Vermont, and he thinks that a lot of the data analysis is either not done exactly right, or that the data are so noisy that you shouldn't really take this so seriously.
And Dawes even argues that Kleiber's law itself might not be true.
Is this your car insurance premium? This, even this?
They don't want us to know that there's an easy way to lower your car insurance costs. What you do is you go to simplify.com.
Really take this so seriously.
And Dawes even argues that Kleiber's law itself might not be true.
In the 1960s, there's a symposium on energy, metabolism, some name like this in animals, and at the end of it, they vote 29-0 that it's going to be 3/4, right? Because you got to set some rules. If you go back and look at the data, which no one is really doing anymore, right? The data does not work. Like, it doesn't work.
This is a graph of metabolic rate as a function of mass, based on a study that looked at 391 species of mammals, much larger than Kleiber's range. And it looks like the 3/4 slope fits quite well. But this is just the top part of the chart, the biggest mammals. If you zoom out, you see that the rest of the mammals appear to fall in a line that's closer to 2/3. And in recent studies of bird metabolism, you also find a slope that appears closer to 2/3 than 3/4. Could it be that those French scientists from centuries ago were right? That metabolic rate really does just scale with surface area? Well, not so fast. For one, many recent studies of cold-blooded animals find slopes that are significantly higher than 2/3. The bigger problem is that measuring metabolic rates is difficult. It generally involves putting animals in a container and taking very precise measurements of their heat production or oxygen consumption, all while ensuring that the animal is in an unstressed, low-activity resting state. Unsurprisingly, this is particularly difficult to pull off with large animals. And as a result, many studies have found scaling exponents where the error bars include both 2/3 and 3/4. Today, the research community is split. Many uphold Kleiber's law in the 3/4 scaling, while others think it's 2/3. But a growing number suspect that there is no universal scaling exponent across all of life. In fact, it may very well be the case that the metabolic rate of larger mammals scales as their mass to the 3/4, while for smaller ones, it's their mass to the 2/3.
It's like everything in science, that there are people arguing, and that's good.
I guess the big exhortation would be someone to really measure things beautifully. We're in 2026. It has to be not just one elephant at one zoo. It needs to be measured again really well.
What everyone does agree on is that scaling laws are real.
Life is not linear all the time. There are deals to be had. There's often in real life departures from proportionality, and you have to be aware of it. Sometimes things punch above their weight, and as you get bigger, you get more efficient. Sometimes there are detriments to size.
So it pays to know how things scale. Clearly, from an energy efficiency perspective, animals benefit from being larger. Similarly, all of us potentially stand to gain from having more people living in larger cities. It could lead to more discoveries and inventions, and in doing so, improve the standard of living for all of us, which might even give us more heartbeats in our lifetimes. From the surface law to Kleiber's law to WBE theory, how metabolic rate scales with mass has been one of biology's biggest debates for centuries. By collecting better data and analyzing it carefully, there's a good chance that the next generation of researchers could be the ones to finally put this debate to rest. It could be one of you watching, or a student that you know. And today's sponsor, Brilliant, is helping to train the next generation of researchers, preparing their...
Now I see. Okay. I was not satisfied with the end of the video because I'm like, okay, they mentioned... I don't know that I even want to go into it, but they're like, there's nothing. Okay, what was the point of the video if you just mentioned that? Well, we don't know if, there are reasons why maybe some obfuscation of the data could exist, and okay, well then, what? I mean, how is that relevant? That's not the point. The point was, why do animals have 1 billion heartbeats? And they already answered that. But he was like, sort of ending the video on a note of like, the reasons for misshapen data, I guess. And that just feels like, why are you ending the video there? And then I realized, okay, they have an ad. That's why. and basically the call, the way that they're ending the video is a call to action saying, and like, you can be someone who innovates medical research. Okay, I get that, but it's involving the ad Brilliant, and that's sort of, I guess that was the whole point. Like, they were talking about a question that is relevant in society, and then they're sort of saying, well, if you're someone in the space of this type of interest, we have Brilliant company that, I guess, teaches people to maybe, I don't know. I mean, I didn't use this thing when I was a student in like middle school or high school, so that does seem something cool to do, but like then this goes on into sort of a different conversation, sort of like public funding, public school, private schools, politics, gender. Like are you someone who, I always thought it was funny that I had friends, or I tried to make friends in school by sharing my interest in video games, and then for some reason I always noticed that most of the girls were like, oh, we don't play that, or we don't do that. I'm like, why? Why don't you play video games? You're weird. And so nowadays it does seem like there's like a high statistic of apparently women graduating from schools, and somehow men are not part of that. I don't know. All of that is very cultural, in the moment type of thing, and I feel like there is an attack on education. Like, I feel like, I don't know, they're just, people are taking it, being like, I don't care about higher education. I don't know. That's I'm gonna go back to my point. So, it does seem like people want to go back to living in 0 BC, or they want to go back to living in 1950s. Is that really, like, I don't know. I think this is not to be mean. I what I say is usually not mean-spirited. It's just that I'm so factual about things that I think people's feelings are hurt regardless. So I would have to like not be myself in order to not hurt other people, and so I can't do that. So people's feelings are gonna get hurt regardless. I feel like people are just living in a world where they feel disconnected from what they feel other people should perceive of them. Like, the other people should perceive of them as more important than other people. And I feel like that is something that occurs in the spaces of fundamentalist people. Like, somehow, if you're just a fundamentalist, that is what perfection means to them. And then that sort of like doesn't help. Again, maybe in their eyes it does, but like, people who value modern education or modern life, they may not see that point of view. So I do feel like for some reason there's an attack on modern society, on modern education, simply because some people feel like their religious beliefs matters more, and therefore they should be more important than other people. That's kind of weird. I don't fully understand that thing that's occurring in the world. It does seem to be in the news, I guess, and something about politics. I don't know. I hate politics, so
minds to solve the huge questions they'll face. Brilliant is a cutting-edge personal tutor that helps any student excel in math, science, and coding. When it comes to learning, one-on-one tutoring really is the gold standard, but this can be expensive and logistically difficult. As a substitute, students often turn to AI for guidance. But most AI platforms hinder learning by simply just giving away the answers. So instead, Brilliant is designed to guide students to their own aha moments by asking probing questions and by breaking problems down step by step. For instance, check out what happened when I launched one of Brilliant's lessons on rotating coordinates.
Okay, so I feel like this is where the branch diverges. This guy has an investment on this company, and so I understand that he's sort of plugging the company. I would not end the video here because I am not them. I am Ivan Pena. I feel my personal life has led me to have experiences where I feel I am able to adequately verbalize a concept that I'm actually angry about towards other medical doctors. And it recently occurred in this past weekend where I had an interest in this is for another video, but I had an interest in essentially having a conversation, an intelligent, well mannered, deep conversation about mortality, about, I guess, religious perspectives, about modern society, about death with dignity, about aging, about that type of stuff. I was thoroughly insulted, and I experienced medical malpractice and financial exploitation for doing that. I do not respect your intelligence or your education now. Now I'm getting upset because a particular individual, within 3 to 4 minutes of me being myself, and I have never experienced any form of not in my right of mind or hallucinations or anything like that. I really truthfully was trying to have an intellectual conversation, and yet I was perceived as retarded. I was perceived, and maybe they were naive. Maybe they believed things that other people tell them, and that's my point. If you are an intelligent person and you are letting people stupider than you tell you what to believe, then I don't respect you. Because I had now almost 11 doctors after that one first person. And it does seem to be that they maybe had a different perspective of me after speaking to me when that never should have happened. Basically, because one person said because I was talking about my YouTube channel where like I actually have a educational background in music and an interest in like originating better audio recordings because I think of music in a different way from other people. I think of music as psychoacoustics, and what about sound creates a certain mood or feeling. And this is really the realm of composers and music producers and even scientists that study this type of thing. And so I came at them respectfully and intellectually, and then I was receiving, he thinks he has special abilities because he's talking about Michael Jackson videos on his YouTube channel. I told him, you can look up the YouTube channel. They didn't take the time to talk to me. In 3 to 4 minutes, they decided that I was impaired to reality. That was medical malpractice. That was financial exploitation. I don't have to receive a bill for something like that. And so this hot, arrogant doctor, and probably in his mind, thinking that he can label me in a way that is not even... He's the one that's labeling me not based in reality. I came there in my full faculties, expecting a longer conversation, and they gave me 3 minutes. And because I spoke to them in a way that they were saying, "Oh, you're just rushing," and blah. I'm rushing. You're giving me 3 minutes. I don't think you respect people. And maybe, and I'll give them the credit that maybe I am not the common denominate. Is that the right word? I'm not the common demographic that maybe they would perceive of me. But also that does bring into question, based on my appearance, what do they perceive of me? Do they think I'm retarded just because of the way that I showed up? I don't appreciate that. And I don't think any patient that feels disappointed by arrogant doctors who are just finding the bill code so that they can bill you. I don't think any patient appreciates that. So for anyone who's ever been fucked over by the medical system, I'm here on your side. I just want you to know that.